Hey, good afternoon, good morning, whenever you're watching this. It's good to see you. I am alone today for today's deep dive. Drew's out on a personal day, and so good for him. And so they're actually letting me do this on my own, so we'll see if they ever do that again. Not sure what I'm going to say, so we'll see how it goes. But first of all, I want to thank everyone just for giving us great feedback. No matter how you discuss things with us, whether it be on a DM or you're sending us a message on maybe text or at the office or talking to one of your advisors. And just from that feedback, it really is setting up the content that we always have on deep dives. And then also it kind of gives us feedback on how do we go a little bit deeper. And so today I want to talk about basically three different topics. And these topics are all building upon previous content that we've covered over the last couple of weeks, just from questions from y'all. And so the first one really has to do with inflation and this phrase called sticky inflation. And what is that? And what does that matter? And so whenever you think about it, inflation can be a short period of time, but then all of a sudden it can decrease. Maybe it goes to deflation. So the pricing of things goes down. And oftentimes that's more event driven whenever you see inflation that's there for a short period of time. So put on your history caps and think back all the way to September the 11th, 2001. If you remember correctly, gas prices doubled on that day and a couple days after that we paid at the gas stations. Was that because of supply demand issues? Was that because of just the pricing going up? Well, actually, that went up because of a singular event. And then all of a sudden, as we got further away from the event, it went down. And so that's something which is more of a short term. I know that the last couple of years, the Federal Reserve and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen used the word transitionary inflation. That's really what they were talking about. Was this is simply a short-term item? However, they misdiagnosed and got things totally incorrect because they were only looking at one singular event, which was reopening the economy from when it was shut down from COVID. But we know there was more events tied to it than that. We're going to talk about that here a little bit later on today because that speaks to what we call about sticky inflation. Which sticky inflation is once we have the inflation, whatever the events were that were driving it, it does not go back down. And so we'll talk about that. And the big question is that we heard from another person is, well, how does this really affect me long term as it relates to, let's say, my long-term goals, something 10, 20, 30 years out? Is it really that significant if we see inflation move up by a little bit here and there? So that's the first topic. The second one is I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a case in front of the Supreme Court right now, which that is President Biden's executive signature on a piece of policy that would actually forgive up to $20,000 per borrower of the college loans. And using the HEROES Act as the reason for that. Now, you all know that we don't get political, so I may have strong views one way or the other. But when it comes to things we talk about, oftentimes there's some tinge of something which is coming about because of a political decision. And yet those decisions do affect us in the real world as far as how do we make decisions to better ourselves economically in the midst of that. So I want to talk about that and what are some impact points from that, depending upon how the Supreme Court rules on that issue currently. Then also want to talk about, hey, a little bit of uncertainty in the marketplace. We've had to adjust in the first couple of months of the year and what the Federal Reserve is doing and how to position things for the remainder of this year. So kind of a brief headway. A lot of stuff moving, guys. A lot of questions coming up. A lot of uncertainty. And you got to have facts and truth in order to be in a better position to make wise decisions that give you a certain level of comfort. So as always, that's what we try to provide for you guys. So this whole thing, now there's going to be a graphic coming up on the screen, and it's going to be talking about a number of things going back in price changes from 2020 all the way through 2022. And so it's kind of interesting. Broadly across the course of everything, prices or general inflation are up 74% since 2000. Actual numbers, depending upon area and sector, it varies widely. And so let's look at some of those. So we really have two types of different things to look at, or categories that we're looking at here. One is goods, and the other is services. So if you remember back in time, we always talked about how automation and structure and processes and technology, that was actually going to drive the cost to produce goods down. So that makes logical sense, right? As we increase in technology, as we bring about better processes, as we have better automations, which is being driven really by a lot of different robotics and technology, the cost to produce things will go down. So that's goods. So let's just kind of look over the last 22 years. Things like vehicles, household furnishings, clothing, cell phone services, software, toys, television, those have all gone down for the most part in pricing. We do see a sharp uptick in cars, household furnishings, and clothing ever since COVID came into being in 2020. However, that was simply a short-term reaction. We see those becoming negative here in the next 2 to 3 years. But across the board, automation and technology did decrease the cost and the turnaround time to produce certain goods. On the flip side, though, is the services area of the conversation. Things such as hospital services, college tuition, college textbooks. All three of those areas are up between 150 and 240% over the last 22 years. So if you look at hospital services, the true annualized inflation rate is a little bit over 10% per year. College tuition and cost is up about 185% in that period of time. And so we're looking at about an 8.5%, 9% increase of overall inflation. Textbooks are also up. Now, what has driven that cost? We look at a number of different factors. Quite honestly, I believe that student loans and the access to student loans has driven that. So we have more dollars going into a limited resource. So that does push up the price of things. Medical care services, child care, food and beverage, and housing. And that housing is either from rent, the rents that people are paying, or even from, as far as construction of homes. When we look at this, we say, that's kind of interesting because why would food and beverage be going up? Isn't that more of buying a good? Well, the reality is it goes back to the service. And so whenever you go to a restaurant, what people that are serving you, what they get paid plays into the overall cost of the bill. And that in turn increases the price of things. So if you look back over the last number of years, you see this sharp increase over the last 3 years in food and beverage. Well, that has really been driven as we've seen more states, and even from a federal level, there being discussion of increasing the federal minimum wage up to $15 an hour. As we saw many states put in prorated increases, or gradual increases, over the next 3 to 5 years in order to get up to a $15 an hour minimum wage. So as we see the price going up as far as on that, it's accretive. And so the price of acquiring the food, the price of the people that are delivering the food to the restaurant, the price of the people or the wage of the people that are serving you in the restaurant, if every single wage increases, well, then we're going to see a compounding increase in the price of our restaurant bill. And so college tuition and fees, let's look at hospital services. We know from Fidelity every year they do a study of the average cost of medical care outside of what's paid from insurance or from Medicare for a 65-year-old couple over their lifetime is estimated to be $360,000 of out-of-pocket expenses aggregate over their lifetime. And if that's increasing at 10 to 11% a year, we know in the next 10 years that number is actually going to go up somewhere to the mid $400,000. So we look at inflation that's accretive in the services area, and those inflation costs are not going to come down through technologies because we have the price of the individuals that are working and their pay is increasing at a rate that we're going to continue to see inflation going up in those areas. And because of that, you need to plan for that as far as in your overall retirement planning to say how are you going to cover those added expenses. And so whenever you look at it, you want to think about two sides of the inflation coin, goods. And in that, we could see a decrease or a deflation or a decrease in the prices of goods brought about by automations. However, when it comes to services, if what is being provided to you has a higher level of service input or human input, in that case, the cost is accretive and it's going up. If you think about it, whenever somebody receives a wage increase, let's say they go from $12 an hour to $15 an hour, a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, their pay, hourly pay, will not decrease. It never decreases. It always continues to be the same or increased. So that cost will continue to go up. So inflation does have a damaging impact as far as in the dollars that you have. And so you want to make sure you recognize that as far as in the plan that you have. The second thing I wanted to talk about has to do with two of the larger areas on that increase in the chart that we had up previously. That's college tuition and fees and college textbooks. And so I'm not going to discuss about should a person, from a moral standpoint, should they be forced to repay a loan they took out. We're not simply forgiving a loan. It's actually being transferred over to another person to pay that loan. And so the reality is those dollars have already been spent, and now it's come time to pay for it. Who's going to pay for it? We're not going to discuss that. Instead, what I do want to talk about is the case before the Supreme Court. And just from a practical output standpoint, how does that affect us? And so we have a case, and we have President Biden signed an executive order, of which we had used the HERO Act from 2001 as the reasoning why that during COVID we should have a payoff of up to $20,000 of school loans. And then there's been 6 different people that have sued the federal government over that, 5 state attorney general and 1 other entity from the state of Missouri. They've sued the federal government on that. And so the case was heard before the Supreme Court earlier, as far as in this previous week, the last week in February, first week in March, so March the 2nd. Now, on that, the case was simply saying, is this a constitutional ability the president has to simply wipe off that level of debt? And so let's say that bill, or it's not a bill, actually, it's an executive order. Let's say that gets turned down by the Supreme Court. Then what's the impact on that? And so, in other words, the students, whoever has the loan, is forced to repay it themselves. The reality is, right now, for a lot of students, or former students, graduates, or those that never graduated but still have student loans, a lot of them are paying between 30 and 40% of their monthly take-home income in their student loan payments. We recognize that in the future, that's only going to grow because of the previous mentioned topic, which is the rise in the cost of services as it relates to college tuition fees and textbooks. And so because of that, what that does by making those payments, that decreases the amount of extra dollars or discretionary dollars that those people have in their budget to buy additional goods and services in the economy. We know the economy only grows whenever somebody buys something. So since they're spending 30 to 40% of their monthly pay to repay a college loan, then they don't have other dollars to reinvest back into the economy. So that's the negative. Our economy, the global economy, not just the U.S. economy, is really based upon consumption or purchasing of things. So that could actually slow down the growth of the economy, and that slowdown could actually continue on for quite some time. But let's say the federal government does say we're going to remove the responsibility from those people, and the Supreme Court agrees with them to pay back $20,000 of loans. Then what happens on that? Well, then that loan just does not disappear. It simply is transferred over to an overall responsibility of the U.S. government. And the reality is that we all recognize that's an additional dollar amount that all of a sudden then has to be repaid at some point by the taxpayers within the United States of America, within the citizenry. And so that means we'll probably end up seeing at some point tax rates need to increase to pay for the extra interest that is being paid on that debt, which now the interest is being deferred or taken away from the individual loan borrowers and is being transferred ultimately into the citizenry broad-based within the country. And the way to pay for that is actually coming from taxes. So the question is, taxes on who? Is it individuals? Is it corporations? Is it additional fees? The reality is that any new taxes, even to a corporation, ultimately make their way back down to the consumer. So it's something in which it looked like it was going to be 7-2 with the Supreme Court justices favoring the plaintiff. And so in that case, that would not be allowed to move forward, and the loans would not be forgiven and transferred over to the books of the U.S. government. Now, that being said, with the first day of rebuttal arguments coming from the defendant, the U.S. government, the Solicitor General provided a lot of very good rationale, and a number of the justices, and actually both those that have more of a conservative bias and those that have a liberal bias, actually were swayed a little bit in their thinking at least from their answers to questions. So we'll see how that goes. It does have an impact, and we'll see how it plays out in time. Lastly, I did want to talk about briefly, we're seeing the market still having volatility. Right now, it's all being driven, as it has been for the last 15 months, based upon interest rates and what the Federal Reserve is going to do as far as raising of interest rates. Right now, everybody is factoring in a 1/4 point increase for March the 15th, and then possibly another one later this year. But then to see how things go as far as with inflation. Reality is they want to try to get back down to the 2% inflation rate as far as core inflation within the United States. That is going to be a longer journey to get back down to that, simply because, as I mentioned before, we're seeing an increase as far as the payrolls and hourly wages. It'll take a while to work that out of the system. And so whenever you look at all those things, everybody, it's a question like, man, oh man, a lot going on. We see sticky inflation is going to be there for a while. That sticky inflation is going to play into either higher interest rates or higher elevated interest rates for a season, which does cause a little bit of instability in the markets. As you guys know, we've already made adjustments in portfolios, and I would encourage you to really make sure you tie your portfolios to your risk tolerance. And risk is based upon how long until you're going to need access to those funds. If you have questions on that as far as your personal portfolios, your retirement plans at work, and if we've not talked about it before, definitely connect with your advisor. Have a quick 15-minute phone call and just kind of walk through what it is you need to do, if anything, right now in your portfolios to make sure they're balanced out with your goal objectives and risk. Hey, always, guys, thanks so much for trusting us. I hope you were able to glean a couple pieces of information so you understand things a little bit at a deeper level. And we'll connect with you again next time here on The Deep Dive. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.